Good morning, Creative Mornings, Oakland. When we were thinking about Preserve, we knew that we wanted to have someone come in and talk about food. Food as culture, food as cultural heritage. For me, it reminded me of when I used to work at a restaurant, a lot of fancy plated ceviche, but the clientele usually ordered the steak or the pasta. One of the chefs on a Sunday morning was really excited. He was making something new and asked me to come over. He said, "Daniel, I'm making a chicken banh mi. I want you to try it out." Being Vietnamese myself, I was excited to see what his chicken banh mi was all about. And what was presented to me was a grilled chicken breast with cilantro, mayo, and some jalapenos on a French roll. To me, that's not a banh mi. Banh mi is Vietnamese for sandwich. And to me, banh mi sandwich is thinly sliced ham, some chalua that's also draped over it, a French baguette that it has a little bit of pâté, has some head cheese, has some fish sauce, has some cilantro, pickled vegetables, but it's not like mayo and deli meat on a French roll. But to the Vietnamese people, banh mi is more than just a sandwich. It represents colonialist history because baguettes were not invented in Vietnam. They were brought there by the French. So there is a complicated and almost time capsule in how we eat and celebrate banh mi. Sure, it's part of our heritage, but it's also a sort of nod to where we've come from. So when selecting our speaker this month, we had Aileen Suzara, who is the founder of Sariwa Kitchen. Aileen to us represents that preservation of food culture and bringing together people and sharing in that, and also thinking about preservation of that culture. Aileen Suzara.
Hello, good morning. So pleased to be here. Thank you so much. Happy to see a lot of new faces and some older faces. And you know, the one thing I'll note is that when I was approached by Creative Mornings to do this, quite a few months ago, I didn't realize that I would be pulling an Ali Wong baby cobra and showing up here. But happy, last day of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And yes, and on a personal note, happy first trimester day to me. So I'm glad I could share this with a room full of new people. As we get started, I just want to I know you've been doing icebreakers or warm-ups already together in the room, but for me to get a sense of who you are, I had a couple of questions. Okay, easy ones, okay? So it's Friday morning. So question, who here has a green thumb and grows things? All right, I love how yes. All right, who here has like a thumb of death? Plants die, okay. How about any folks here actively grow food on their own? Yes. How about, is anyone here descended maybe one generation away from family that grew food? How about 2 generations? 3? Not sure. Okay, so there's quite a few. So, I think with today, going with the theme, wanted to just bring in some of those questions of remembering and our connections. Can you recover the things that you were supposed to forget? So I invite you to ask yourself that now or at the end. Can you recover the things that you were supposed to forget? So I grew up a child of the 80s, like some people in this room, and I was a daughter of Philippine immigrants who traveled to chase their American dream, following the siren call that brought healthcare workers from the Philippines in the 60s into the US. And to show you just how 80s and 90s we were, I have this picture. Oh yeah. Back in style, right? So this is our family. For my parents, when they first arrived, landing straight from the Philippines, having never left the country before, and going straight to Buffalo, New York, as part of their survival mechanisms was to try to assimilate, try to keep some things on the DL. That was how they could make it in a new land. So even if they couldn't gain complete acceptance in a new environment, they could at least try not to stand out so much. And my parents shed 4 distinct languages. They knew so much. But they kept Tagalog as a secret code between themselves so they could talk about people in public or talk about my sister and I, but they didn't quite pass the language on since at the time, in the US education system, they were told that teaching their children their own mother tongue would make them confused in speaking English, which we now know is not the case at all. Our kitchen very much reflected a lot of these changes, and we bounced between New York, Houston, in Texas, Southern California, Washington, where I was born. We were like a Filipino tumbleweed family, rolling from place to place. And wherever we went, our kitchen reflected these changes, but had some kind of staple goods. There was a mixture of flavors from here and there. Some were fried fish and salt, garlic, mac and cheese, Pop-Tarts, and lots of Spam. So young as I was at that point, I already felt something essential was missing at the core. I was so curious. I had so many questions. I wanted to know more about our family roots, our mysterious past. I wanted to know more about myself through the lens of our family. And then good accidents happen. This is when I had this turning point. So I was a really weird kid who didn't really have any friends and would spend a lot of time building fantasy worlds by myself. And I remember digging through all of these books that my parents had, cookbooks that we didn't actually use. And in the middle of it, this is the actual one, I found this book, Recipes of the Philippines. It was all bound up in contact paper. With yellow pages, and inside of it, my mind was blown. This was the first time I had ever seen Filipino food or Filipino anything in print, ever. Even though I was familiar with going to the parties or the baptisms and seeing the familiar foods of pancit or lumpia or adobo, I opened this book and I saw things that I had never seen before. And even though it was published during the American era and written in English so I could understand it, it was like seeing a completely new language. Reading about long beans and wing beans and jackfruit cooked in coconut milk and soft-shelled crabs. I didn't know what these things were, but I was hungry to learn something more. And so I drank that up, and my mom, even though she didn't actually love being in the kitchen so much, she was a complete enabler, which was great, and she and I together embarked on trying to relearn and recreate some of these recipes. And that meant sometimes referring back to old memories from 40 plus years ago. It meant making things up sometimes, looking for ingredients, trying to substitute, add, or change things. But I think that time was so formative because it planted the seed of seeking something else out and taught me somehow that even in the pages of something as simple as a cookbook, you could find yourself reflected in there, and these pieces began to click together. So from that seed of remembering, though, it took me years to really realize that what we eat, how we eat, all of us reflect not only our individual histories, but also something wider and collective. And so later is while we were living in Hawaii. Raise your hand if you lived in Hawaii here. Anybody? All right. I knew there's some Hawaii Island people here. When I was living there, began to actually learn and see from friends that they were working for their own self-determination. And one of the most tangible ways they were doing that was regrowing culture through food. Maybe it's growing their taro, learning the language around it, beginning to feed themselves these ancestral foods. And that actually pushed me. As much as I loved it, I felt this like nagging sense of responsibility to say, what does that actually mean for me as a Filipino American? Like, what are the sides of our identity that I've been hiding from or that I don't want to look at? And so, kind of jumped headfirst and began to try to seek out and relearn pieces of history that maybe were forbidden from my family and earlier generations. Began to relearn our language in classes, stumbling through and like having the worst pronunciations, but just trying so hard to recover these things from language, to begin learning how to regrow some of our own foods and doing it in community spaces, and also learning about having an environmental responsibility that came from who we were. I dabbled in like everything. Dance, language, whatever you could. And it was such a privilege. It is such a privilege to relearn things that our ancestors maybe were taught they were not supposed to continue, and to bring it back and to find these things out. But one thing that was a little unnerving, and I'm not trying to pick on Spam here, I'll admit I actually ate a Spam musubi about 2 weeks ago, is that I was so shocked to realize that the things that tasted like home to me, that were so embedded in like how I thought about family, actually were rooted in this colonial history. I don't know if people here are familiar with that. I'll do just little nuggets of history here. But I realized my passion for Spam was a byproduct of the military. And even though my favorite thing in the world was the smell of garlic rice frying and Spam in the pan, and that made me feel warm and loved in my belly, I had to realize that, even though this felt like home, maybe things are a little bit more complicated. And so let's just zoom forward. Some people in the room know this. I began to kind of unravel how you can even pick one strand of a food and find an entire history embedded into it. So, Philippines, who here has heard the phrase, raise your hand, if, 300 years in a convent and 50 years in Hollywood? All right, you can talk to those people who raise their hands later, get more of the scoop. But for those who aren't familiar, in the Philippines, extremely diverse, 7,000 plus islands, regional foods, languages, of course has an indigenous history and present with so many different flavors, that reflect the place. Mix in 300 years in the convent, which is referring to 300 years of Spanish colonization, but also trade between Mexico and the Philippines and the galleon trade, which is why some things like chilies, mangoes, and corn, for example, have found their way to Asia, and likewise other things have traveled back and forth across the Pacific. And then you had the 50 years in Hollywood, or maybe 50 years of McDonald's, when you had this sudden shift in the food, the language, Hollywood, everything. My dad, for example, he grew up in his village, and they had a movie theater, and it showed almost exclusively American Hollywood films at that time. So there was this exchange of flavors and media at the time. And then, of course, you have migration all over the country. So many Filipinos. Were the second largest Asian American group in the country, even though sometimes the representation doesn't feel like it's quite there yet, but especially in California and Hawaii. So this is home for me. And I was shocked again to figure out these things that we love might not always love us back. And then what do you do with that? And so digging forward, I began to hear a different kind of story within my own family and community. And this was hearing people continue to talk about some of the diseases that they were facing, chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, none of the fun stuff, right? That's not the fun stuff. But it was so prevalent. I heard that some folks actually said that doctors called it, quote, Filipino heart disease, as though that's like a family heirloom that you pass on. Like, oh, I'm giving you my heart disease. Someone sent me this meme, which is I was like, what? This is an actual meme? I didn't even make this, you guys. I don't know how to make memes. Someone else made this. They texted it to me. They're like, hey, you probably would appreciate this. I was like, oh, okay. But it's just so there. And again, not picking on Spam because I know it's complicated. But I started to just think, okay, here is one story that we hear a lot about, right? People saying Filipino food is good for the soul, but bad for the heart. And you kind of laugh about it a little bit. But I wanted to go deeper and ask, is that really true? Does it have to be true? Does the aftermath of colonization have to be something that shows up in our vital signs as well? On the flip side of that, and some people in this room are actually responsible for building that, you have maybe Filipino foods, the foods of culture and love and home, being villainized. On the other hand, they're also being celebrated and uplifted and stepping into this new platform with questions like, what took it so long? Where have you been? Even though we're already been here. And so, you're kind of straddling this word of being demonized on one side or trendified on the other. And even though there's things to celebrate from both, what do you actually do with that? How I chose to interpret it, and I know others do too, is to think, okay, culture isn't static, right? Culture changes. We all know this. The question is, who also gets to decide what is tradition or not? What's authentic or not? Does authenticity actually matter so much? And what really matters the most? So when I began to approach food in a different way personally, and I began to actually launch a food business, Sariwa, which means fresh in Filipino, I took this understanding that the stories that we hear or the stories that others tell about us can have the power to harm us, or they can have the power to heal us. And so, what is the most important thing? Is there a way that our foods can actually be part of this healing? Is that actually the new tradition that we can bring forward? Can we actually change our story? So, I started to try to look for a different story. And apologies for those who heard this before. I'm growing into my true Filipino uncle that is going to just tell the same story and the same punchline and have a little belly to rest stuff on. But one of the teaching moments I had was, I was convinced I had to find this perfect teacher, either a magical farmer or a magical grandmother cook in the Philippines who would impart their wise wisdom, and I would have my own Jedi moment and be able to come back anointed with recipes and secrets. So I remember going, and we were in my mom's province in Pangasinan, which is very rural and beautiful and very agrarian. We woke up before dawn, went to the marketplace, painstakingly looked for the milkfish, looked at all these amazing vegetables that were grown in the village. We were on this mission to make Sinigang, which is usually a tamarind soured soup. And I just remember it took us probably 5 hours to gather all the ingredients. When we finally got home, I just couldn't wait. I was this is so perfect. This is my moment. And he started a fire under the mango tree grove, and they brought up the clay pot, and everything was exactly how I fantasized about it. And then, when we were about to make the broth, and I was waiting for someone to start pounding tamarind pods by hand, someone brought out the seasoning packet, which you can buy here. It's what? We had the whole day to do this, and this packet had just followed us 2,000 miles around the world, even in this village setting. And so I was honestly a little bit disappointed, and then I was disappointed at myself for being disappointed. You get into that weird spiral thing. And I was oh my gosh, what is wrong with me? Even though, convenience and packaging and the realities of change have happened, we're still here in this village cooking soup collectively with, local homegrown vegetables, but I couldn't see it. I was just so mad about this packet that was showing up. I put the weight of restoring a culture onto this single condiment, and that was just kind of hilarious, actually. And I realized that you have to kind of be okay with looking at tradition in the eye and sometimes bending it to where you are and when you are, and not throwing away the teachers that are right in front of you. And so I was okay, that felt like a blessing of some sort. To go ahead, you go out into the world, worry less about authenticity and more about, is this food good? And is it good for us? And where is it going to take us next? I kind of rolled with that and decided it was time. I really wanted to start a food business and form my community. The first pop-up for Sariwa was actually right after Typhoon Haiyan, which some of you might remember. At the time, it was one of the worst climate disasters around the world. We've now had worse, but community began to just gather around in so many different ways to raise funds for that. We had this 100-person dinner right in Oakland. If some of you have been to Cosecha, Oakland here before, they're bomb, right? So they so generously offered their restaurant space, and we had our first dinner there, also together with our friends, the People's Kitchen, who supported that. And that just planted a seed that there had to be a way to move forward and grow with that. After kind of taking some of the learning from that, I went to Lacina. People familiar with Lacina? Oh, yeah. Actually, raise your hand if you work with Lacina or volunteer with Lacina here. What? Yes. Being at Lacina was the first time to actually step into a place in this kitchen with other, mostly women, immigrants, women of color, who are really committed to reconnecting communities or introducing communities to the flavors of who they are and what they are. And while I was there with Sariwa trying to figure out, okay, I know that I'm not necessarily going to be a farmer. I had spent a couple years doing that. There are other people growing these vegetables and doing it way better than I can. How can we have a business that lifts them up, protects our seeds, celebrates our culture, and maybe is part of this bigger movement to tell a different story about what Filipino-American food is? So I stepped into that. But ultimately, while growing a business, and I know there are a number of people out here who grow food businesses themselves, including Filipino food businesses, I had to just keep reconnecting back to a core value. And what is that? It was knowing that in choosing food, it wasn't really just about getting people to eat more vegetables, even though I'm a vegetable evangelist. It wasn't just about nutrients or calories, although those things are nice. But it's really at the core about recovering tradition. It's about changing painful narratives of loss and erasure into something that can be healing and restorative. And tradition, really, it's about remembering those who came before and all those sacrifices that they had to make so that we could be here right now. It's about culture, not as something you put away on a shelf, unless it's a pickle, you can put that one on the shelf. But it's about culture that's not just something you put away on a shelf or try to freeze in time, but about having a muscle memory, practicing it, bringing it back into the world. Something that you keep alive so that you're able to pass it on to the next generations. So maybe the most essential thing that I've learned is that our foods don't begin and end at the plate. It's everything before and everything after. The most fulfilling things I've ever experienced with food actually weren't just about the moment when you feed someone. It's really about making sure that there are different generations that are going to have a piece that they can carry forward and make their own. It's about finding out where we came from and where we're going and allowing us to have a more delicious future. So as I stand here, I'm on the brink of becoming a first-time mom. Oh, thank you. I feel like I was like fishing for like nice sounds, so thank you. You know, I used to often already time travel even before this time in life, thinking about being 8 and being 24 and 30 and all these kind of turning points around culture and food and remembering. And now I feel like I have this different sense of time that goes beyond me. And I try to imagine this someone else further off in the future. And I'm wondering what she's going to inherit from my life, from our decisions. You know, what kind of air is she going to breathe? What are the things that she's going to taste? And I think this is one of the true gifts of our tradition. You know, it's our living memory. It's in our ties to our past and our present and future. And it helps us reimagine what's next. So thank you so much.